I guess we can get started now. I'm trying to see, Loretta, can you hear us if I speak from here? Loretta?
Yes, sorry, yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Stay here with us.
Hi, Loretta.
Hello, hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loretta, a bit volume a bit up because I have difficulties hearing you, to be honest. She can't see us.
I can see you, but
you can't see us.
Very quiet.
You can see us, yeah? So, okay. All right, so welcome everyone. Let's get started. So my name is Hyun-Bang Shin. I'm Professor of Geography and Urban Studies here at the LSE in the Department of Geography and Environment, and also Director of the center named Associate of Southeast Asia Center, which is co-hosting this event together with the Urban Salon, which is a London-based seminar series, which you're, I guess, familiar with, and also Department of Geography and Environment, which is another co-host. So welcome everyone to this Urban Salon event, which is the first one in this academic year. And it's actually very nice to have this in-person evening event. We've been having this all more or less on Zoom only, and nice to have people and old faces and colleagues coming here in person to join us. We have our speaker, Dr. Matthias Bernt, joining us from, who is here all the way from Berlin. Wonderful to have him. And we also have Mike Edwards, who is joining from UCL, and Loretta Lee is joining us from Boston University in the US. So thanks so much, Loretta, for joining us from there. Well, this event will be really reflecting on the book Matthias has published recently, and the book is entitled The Commodification Gap, Gentrification and Public Policy in London, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. And Matthias and I had a coffee just now before coming here, and according to what Matthias has said, it's really meaningful for him to have this event in London, where the initial idea of the book started. So it's really great to have this and pleasure of us to host Matthias for this event. But this event is going to be recorded for future dissemination. And if you don't want to be in the recording by any chance, then just let us know by writing to SEAC admin account, which is seac.admin@ls.sd.uk, and we'll basically edit you out from the recording when disseminating the recording of the event. For anyone attending via Zoom, during the Q&A session, please use the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to post any questions, and we try to pick up some questions from the Zoom audience, as well as the questions from the audience attending in person. If you're a Twitter user, and I would encourage you to tweet about this event, and when you do that, and then could you tag us using our Twitter handle, which is LSE for SEAC, and LSE Geography for Geography Department, and the Urban Salon for Urban Salons. Well, you can choose. You can choose which one to include if you run out of space. Let me just briefly introduce also what SEAC is about. Southeast Asia Center is a multidisciplinary research center, which is focused on Southeast Asia as a region and using Southeast Asia as a way of engaging with the global debate. And the center works on these areas of urbanization, governance, and connectivity. Urban Salon has been around for many years now. The organizers include, in addition to myself, Loretta Lee, who is joining us as one of the discussants, Jenny Robinson from UCL, Matthew Gandhi from University of Cambridge, and also Monica Dagan from Brunel University, and Phil Hubbard from King's College London. And I think some of them are joining us via Zoom as well. So I guess that's all. I mean, today the talk really is about the book, The Commodification Gap, which I had a pleasure to read. And it's really a very welcoming edition to the literature on critical urban studies, and also to the gentrification literature. And it's really making this inquiries into the extent to which market forces in producing gentrification are profoundly embedded in institutional context that influence the shaping of the land market and land commodification. And we have three speakers, Matthias Bernt, who is the main speaker and the author of the book. He's a sociologist and political scientist who works as a senior researcher at the Leibniz-Institut for Research on Society and Space in Aachen, Germany. And he's also a adjunct professor at Humboldt University in Berlin. And his research focuses on the interrelations between urban development and urban governance. And Matthias has actively participated in various tenant movements in Berlin for more than 2 decades. We have Michael Edwards, who is working on the relationship between property markets and planning, mainly in the UK and Europe. He's active in London planning and most recently supporting community groups in challenges to successive London plans supported by UCL Public Engagement Unit. And he's founding member of the International Network for Urban Research and Action, IJURR, which I would recommend for your attendance if you're interested in that part of the work. And also founding member of the Ukrainian Network UK and Justice Space. Loretta Lees, one of our organizers of Urban Salon, is director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University. So it's a lost cause in London for gains for those in Boston and the US. She's an urban geographer, and probably she doesn't need that much in an introduction. But here, let me just say, she's also a scholar activist who supports and co-produces research within community groups and social movements, most recently with respect to the demolition of council estate in London. So I guess that's it. I mean, today we will have Matthias' initial talk for about 20-25 minutes, followed by Michael's and Loretta's intervention, each speaking for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'll use the remaining time for Q&As. So I guess without further ado, Michael.
Well, thank you for this kind introduction, and also thanks for organizing this event. Can everybody hear me well, or should I speak up? Okay, so thanks for organizing this event. I mean, it's not often that one has the opportunity to discuss a book in an international setting. You know, I'm based in Berlin. Now the discussion is in London, and actually this book goes back to two prolonged research stays, one in London at the University College of London, and one in St. Petersburg, both at the Center for Independent Social Research at European University, St. Petersburg there. And I would first like to start by using the chance to say thank you to the many people who supported me in London, some of whom are in the room now, Michael, Paul Watt, Yun Beng Shin, some are online, Loretta, but also Claire Colombe, Jenny Robinson, Phil Hubbard, and many, many others. So without your support, this book would have been all but impossible. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm amazed that I have the chance to sort of report back and see what you think, what fruits your support bear or did not bear. Having said this, I have 20-25 minutes, right? And I would like to focus on 3 things. First, I would like to talk about what motivated me in writing this book. Second, I want to explain what I mean with the term commodification gap. It's a new concept which I've sort of invented, so I think I should explain what it is about. The third is I want to give you a very, very small insight. It's rather going to be a tour de force through the empirical work I did with the book, and give you something of an impression what I describe with public policy and gentrification in these 3 cities. Let me start with, okay, let me start with this photograph. This is a photo which I took in one of the most gentrified neighborhoods in Berlin. And it's actually an advertising for, well, you see an advertisement, right? An advertisement. It's an ad. So it's an ad for a gym, and it says gentrification for your abs, for your abdominals. And when I came across this poster for the first time, it totally got me. Because I found this poster sort of emblematic for a situation in which the term gentrification has become very popular. I mean, now every taxi driver knows what gentrification is, or seems to know, and at the same time very much blurred and unspecific. I've also come across newspaper articles where the talk was about a gentrified guitar string, or about gentrified cuisine, and so on and so forth. And then I think that this is not only a situation with public discourses, but it's also reflected in the academic debate, which has become increasingly polarized throughout the last 1 or 2 decades. By now, given the danger of oversimplification, I would say that the urban studies community is increasingly split into 2 camps, one of which thinks that the concept of gentrification is overstretched, should be laid to bed. It only refers to the development of some great cities in the northwest of Europe and North America in the late 20th century, but doesn't have any meaning anymore. And the other camp, Loretta Lee's, and I also think Yun belonged to this camp, I think would argue that the concept of gentrification is not only still valid, but that we have more and more cases of gentrification across the globe, but we need to use the concept in a more flexible way to still make it valid. The strange thing is that, you know, both of these positions are alive and kicking, and I don't see that there is much of an in-between and much of a productive discussion between the two. And let me describe that with some personal experience. I get to review papers for journals on gentrification quite often. And I would say 95 of the papers I get on my desk belong into either one or the other camp. So the usual thing you get is a paper on Tbilisi, Oaxaca, Osaka, Osnabrück, or, you know, any city in the world where the author describes gentrification and then either says, well, it's unlike gentrification in the 1970s or 80s in New York City, that's why we shouldn't call it gentrification. Or it says, although it's very different, it's still gentrification, but we need to be more flexible in the context. And sometimes you even get these 2 positions for the same city. And I find that this is intellectually a cul-de-sac, which doesn't lead anywhere. So one motivation for writing this book was really a deep frustration with this very dichotomist use of the term in academic debates. And the other one is that I find much of the research on gentrification not very political. And it sounds, I think, very paradoxical on the first view, on first glance, because many of the authors who write about gentrification are very political persons. And I would only like to mention, you know, Neil Smith's work on early launches or Loretta's work on state-led gentrification and housing estates in London. The point for me is, and all of this work is very good and engaging, but the point is it sort of stands besides theory. So what we have is often very context-specific works, which are rich in detail and engaging, but whose findings can hardly be applied elsewhere. So if you write about state-led gentrification of housing estates in London, I would even find it difficult to transport this term to Germany, not to speak of Russia or China. So you have these very context-specific works and findings, and you have a general theory which doesn't provide much guidance about the political institutional context in which gentrification unfolds in a particular context. So what this leads to is a situation in which I think gentrification literature doesn't really provide much for activists and policymakers beyond the actual context of a particular study that would also work well without using the term gentrification, or very vague gestures in general theory. So these were the 2 problems that I struggled with and that lead to some sense of frustration, which finally made me write this book. And I do think that these problems have something to do with the way that we theorize about gentrification. So the point is not having more cases, having more empirical work, or just using terms more carefully. But I think we need to get back to our theoretical foundations and see where these can be advanced in order to make writing about gentrification possible, which is both more comparative and more political. And when I talk about theoretical references, then of course the cornerstone of much of gentrification theory is the rent gap thesis developed by the Marxist geographer Neil Smith in 1979. I think most of you will be familiar with this graphic, right? So what Neil back then developed in a nutshell is that he said there can be situations where the capitalized land rent falls below what a potential land rent on a piece of land could be, and if this rent gap emerges, if it grows large enough, capital flows back in, the property is fixed up. This leads to price increases, which finally displace lower incomes, which lead to a bidding out process for lower incomes. That's in a nutshell, I think, the rent gap argument. In a nutshell. And in my view, this really describes the essence of gentrification very well. If you ask me what gentrification is about, I would say two things are in the core, and one is investment or reinvestment into the built environment. And the second is displacement. And these two are interconnected. So the rent gap theory, I think, perfectly describes the economic side of gentrification. It's an indispensable cornerstone for any theorizing about gentrification. The problem is that it doesn't provide much guidance when it comes to explaining the actual institutional rent context in which rent gaps are opened, operated, and closed. And there are many issues which could be discussed here, and many of these have been discussed in length over the last decades. And that's a discussion I can't go into in detail this evening. But I would like to focus on two things. The first is that I think that the rent gap discussion very much focuses on situation in which the rent gap is closed, in which capital, in fact, flows into the built environment, and in which properties are uplifted and displacement is achieved. However, we know that this is only half of the story. In reality, we know that there are many instances where land, for example, is left undeveloped because of speculation, where zoning or social housing or rent regulations make the closure or of the rent gap impossible. Or where land is not even treated as a commodity, like in many informal settlements in the global south. And I would argue that the rent gap theory does not exclude these cases, but it doesn't provide much guidance about what to do with them. And my second point is that I think implicitly, the rent gap theory argues that if money is invested into a piece of land, that leads to price increases, which affect the bidding out of low income groups. And that is more or less a free market model. Whereas from many parts of housing studies, we know that the actual price for housing is not only determined by supply and demand, but it's subject to a state market nexus in which variegated forms of decommodification determine the actual cost of housing. So what I'm talking about is things like social housing, rent regulations, housing allowances, and so on and so forth, which I think have a crucial impact on whether or not and to which degree and displacement can take place. So these are my major critiques, which motivated me to try and go beyond the rent gap theory and add something which I call the commodification gap. And what I call the commodification gap, I just quote, from my text, is the disparity between the potential ground rent level which can be achieved for a piece of land when it's fully commodified, and the actual ground rent capitalized when it's decommodified, partly commodified, or decommodified or non-commodified. And I argue that it's only when this gap is closed that investment into housing becomes a viable option and gentrification is set to work. So gentrification, in other words, demands the relative weakness in existence bypassing a lifting of components of housing provision, which are decommodified. And when this is not achieved, gentrification doesn't take place. So in essence, where the rent gap is about the economy of housing, the commodification gap is about this thing. So what I'm interested in this book is how different instances of decommodification, like rent regulations, like social housing, like housing not being put on the market as a commodity, how this impacts on the course of gentrification. That's what my commodification gap is about. It's an attempt to bring the state and to bring policies back into the discussion. From previous discussions, I have learned that many people wonder how the commodification gap is related to the rent gap. That's why I want to take a few minutes to reflect on that. Does it dismiss the rent gap? Is an alternative to the rent gap? Do I aim to falsify rent gap theory? And the clear answer to all these questions is no, I don't. So how I figure, what I try to do is to make the rent gap work in tandem with the commodification gaps. So the idea is that there can't be a commodification gap without a rent gap. If there was no chance to, if it wouldn't make sense to invest in undervalued properties, there would be nothing to decommodify. You know, decommodification wouldn't have an effect. So the rent gap, commodification gap can't work without the rent gap, but the rent gap also operates through the commodification gap. That's my idea. So you could use the picture of a car where maybe the rent gap is the motor and the commodification gaps are the wheels. And no car would work without a wheel or without a motor. Right. So maybe, I don't know how far this metaphor carries, just developed it. But that's the idea. The idea if commodification, if decommodification changes, so does gentrification. And since decommodification, regulations, social housing is subject to very different historically specific trajectories in different countries, it works in very specific ways. So what differentiates the commodification gap from the rent gap is, I think, that I put institutions and regulations into the center. And I suggest that this is a concept which enforces the researchers to more strongly focus on different institutional contexts, on the impact they have and how they develop and how they change. This, I argue, opens gentrification theory and necessitates it to put political struggle, legal institutions, and history into the center of attention. Let me shortly try to give you some flesh to the bones so that you have an idea how this works in the empirical reality. So what I do in this book, the method I use in this book can be described as Marx put it in Grundrisse, as, you know, ascending from the abstract to the concrete and then descending from the concrete to the abstract. So what I did is basically I started with developing a critique of the rent gap theory, thinking about the limits. Then with these limits, I went into 3 different cities, 3 different cases of gentrification. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Examined, you know, how gentrification worked there. And from there, I moved back to the abstract level and developed that concept of commodification gaps. However, the commodification gap, what a commodification gap is, looks very different at different places at different times. So in this book, I came out with 12 gentrification gaps altogether, which worked at different times in different places. And I'm going to try and run you very shortly to that. What I did empirically is I studied the development of gentrification and its mutations in 3 neighborhoods. In Barnsbury here in London, which is a neighborhood which has experienced a very long history of gentrification since the late 1960s, and where gentrification itself has changed quite a lot. And I think many here in the room can say more about that than I ever could. And I describe how gentrification there developed from early gentrification, which was very much influenced by a value gap, meaning a gap between the value of an apartment as a private rented apartment and the value it had for owner occupation when it was sold. And that's a gap that has been described by Bill Randolph and Chris Hamnett very famously in the late 1970s. Then I talk about the impact of the right to buy and the privatization gap, which opened up new opportunities for the valorization of these properties. I talk about the effect of the deregulation of private rentals in the late 1980s and how this led to gentrification also becoming something happening in the private rental sector. And I'm talking about the current situation, which is very much, which has to do a lot with the inflation of house prices that London has seen for a long time now, and with the growing financialization of properties. So what I describe is different institutional contexts, and though these have led to a change of gentrification. The second of my cases is the neighborhood of Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin. It's an inner city neighborhood that was part of East Berlin, so it wasn't subject to market pressure and gentrification until the early 90s, when Germany was reunified and when most of the properties in this neighborhood were restituted. And what makes it very different, what makes Berlin and Germany very different from the UK, is that gentrification mostly takes place in private rental sector, which is actually highly regulated. However, this regulation has a lot of loopholes and bypasses, and these different loopholes and bypasses give way to opportunities for displacement and gentrification. The problem and the thing is that lots of these gaps that I describe here, new tenancy gap, modernization gap, tenure conversion gap, and social housing deregulation gap, won't go into details, are subject to intensive political struggles between the three-tier system of government in Germany. So just to give you one example, the modernization gap includes the opportunity to uplift the rent at 11% of the modernization costs if something like a modern heating system, insulated windows, and so on are added to a property, which drives up rents very fastly. So when Prenzlauer Berg, which was very much under-maintained, which was called the largest urban renewal area of Europe in the 1990s, when it was modernized, so to speak, which means when money was invested and the flats were brought up to a modern standard, this would have immediately resulted in the displacement of most of the population. So the borough, it sort of invented a regulation which introduced rent caps. These rent caps were very contested right from the start, and at the end, they were dismissed at the federal administrative level. And then they invented new caps and new standards for modernization, and was a back and forth between different levels of government, which were tied to different political balances of forces. In Russia, St. Petersburg, I studied the central part of St. Petersburg, and that is already part of the story, because gentrification is actually a very, very new concept in Russia, and it's highly contested whether it is at all applicable. And the reason is that the gentrification process is very dispersed in Russia. When I first arrived in St. Petersburg and I asked scholars to show me a gentrified neighborhood or a neighborhood where gentrification is a thing, they were very, very puzzled and they couldn't name one. Some of them already knew what gentrification was, and they said, certainly there is gentrification, but we can't tell where. And this has very much to do with the privatization of state-owned properties after 91 in Russia, which effectively led to a fragmentation of property situations and ownership. In a normal building in the historical core of St. Petersburg, you usually have 5 different classes of residents. You have residents who lived in the flats before 1991, who privatized their flat. Privatization in Russia means that the flat was given to the sitting residents for a nominal fee and who still live in it. And secondly, you have citizens who bought the flat after 1991, a privatized flat after 1991, using mortgages or cash. Third, you have private tenants who moved into a flat that somebody else has privatized, and rentals are not regulated at all in Russia. So tenants live in very insecure situations. Fourth, you have people who lived in a flat in 1991, but refused to privatize their flat. So they still live there. They are not owners, but they are called municipal tenants. And they only usually pay operation costs. And fifth, you have people who were given a place in a flat by the municipality as a form of social housing. The thing is that usually these 5 different groups live cheek by jowl. So even in a very prestigious location, in a palace from the Tsarist elites, what you find is both very poor and very rich people. And sometimes this is even the case in one flat, because in Russia you have what they call kommunalka, which is a flat where every room is inhabited by a different family. This altogether makes gentrification very, very difficult. And I've talked to developers in Russia who described the whole situation as totally complicated. They said, well, gentrification in St. Petersburg is not a business, it only causes headaches. You just can't settle a deal with everybody. So I know this was a tour de force now across very, very different situations. But I thought I should at least give you an impression what the 3 cities are like and what kind of work I did there. So let me maybe wrap up with saying what I think the commodification gap is good for. So I would argue the first thing I like about my idea, the first thing about the commodification gap is I think that it breaks free, or it attempts to break free from the universality versus particularity binary, because it combines the rent gap as a general explanation of gentrification with the variety of time and place specific commodification gaps. So I hope that if one takes my commodification gap as a starting point, it will be very difficult to end up with a paper which either says, you know, this is not gentrification because it's unlike New York in the 70s, or it is, although we should move somewhere else. So, and secondly and thirdly, I think what I've tried to achieve is I try to integrate variegated, very specific political environments into the explanation of gentrification and put attention both on enabling and disabling conditions of gentrification and how they are politically determined. So the whole book is very much an attempt to enforce a perspective on the policies underpinning gentrification in different environments. And I'm curious to see what others think about it. So I think I will leave it with that here. Thank you for coming here and listening. And I already say thanks, Michael, and thanks, Loretta, for commenting on it.
I guess in that case, we start with Michael and then Loretta in that order. Michael, over to you.
Okay, I've got the Zoom switch on because I was watching this screen. I was going to put my microphone on in case that helps, but
you can give it a try. There might be a bit of echo.
if there's feedback, we'll switch it off again.
Yeah, I think you may have to switch off. There's echo already.
Yep, okay, I'll tell. Well, can you hear me? Good.
Yes.
Okay, well, let me just say first that I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to be asked to comment on this book. And to start off by saying that the core of the book is, in my opinion, absolutely wonderful. It's a really exemplary, by my standards, attempt to do 2 things. First of all, there are 3 chapters, which Matthias didn't mention at all, which are nutshell accounts of the housing situation in the 3 nation states. England, West Germany, and Russia. And those, I don't know enough about the Russia situation to know, but I mean, there's certainly the England and Germany ones are wonderful. Then there are the 3 chapters, which are the case studies of the localities, Barnsbury, Prenzlauberg, and St. Petersburg. And in my view, these are exactly what we've been trying to persuade our students to do for years. Judith Reiser is here, who speaks all the languages and who was involved in this for a while at the Bartlett, of trying to work out ways to teach about the analysis of urban development processes in different places, taking on board the varying histories of class relations in those countries, the terrain, the political geography, and so on. Well, here we've got 3 absolutely wonderful examples of that kind of analysis being done, in my view. Fantastic. And the quality of it has, I mean, I would highlight these components of it. First of all, that the analysis has a very strong historical timeline in which one of the products of the analysis is a periodization of the rise and fall of different regimes of production or forms of gentrification or whatever it is. Secondly, that the relation between the state and capital varies within the story and varies geographically. There are different scales. So different scales in the London story and in the Berlin story, and to some extent in the Russia story. But from my point of view, the property market relationships in this analysis are seen as relationships between individuals and between classes. There's a kind of lurking class analysis in all this, which is a bit, I wouldn't say hidden, but it's kind of discreetly in the background slightly, but it's there. There is always financialization. I mean, there is always consideration of the credit conditions confronting occupiers, owners, purchasers, developers, builders in all these processes. The changing importance of that and the changing conditions governing financialization and the tenure regimes which somehow are the mechanical mechanisms in the housing situation into which the financialization process has to try and engage different forms of ownership, different forms of tenancy, and so on. And then this very valuable emphasis, which becomes the sort of flagship project of the book, to emphasize commodification, decommodification, the limiting of market relationships or the freeing up of market relationships in the story. So all of that to me is really excellent. And my only regret is that I have to give a lecture about the analysis of different housing production systems on Friday to a load of students, and I've got to revise it all now and rethink it in the light of this, because we've got these new wonderful examples. So that's all the very positive stuff. However, I am rather worried that I'm not a good person for the rest of it. I'm the wrong person to have sitting here, I think, because first of all, I've never really got comfortable with the rent gap. I mean, I suppose I started learning about rent and reading rent theory before the rent gap really came in. I'm very old. I read Marx and Harvey and Ben Fine and Michael Ball and Anna Heiler and a whole lot of literature on rent and property relations, which has in a way kept me very well nourished with theoretical tools ever since. And on the rare occasions when I've ventured into this other land where rent gap is the subject matter, I've kind of thought, I don't need that. I'll go back to my theoretical landscape and stay there. And that's where I still am. So I'm amazed to find in these early chapters that not only is there this huge rent gap theory, but there are controversies within it and vast differences of opinion and the whole bibliographies about it, which is new to me. Just one more thing to say about that problem, which is that it looks to me, and I may have got this wrong from my reading of Matthias's work, that within this rent gap universe, the kind of simple Marxist approaches which I've got used to are seen as rather mechanical. And that's true often. I think often it is the case, but equally not always. So there are versions of it, which in particular I associate with Ben Fine, where rent theory is seen as being all about the conditions under which rent can be realized. But there's a lot in Marx and later writers about the conditions under which spatial issues, fertility issues, accessibility issues, architectural character of buildings, access to social infrastructure of the neighborhood, all these things can create conditions in which rents and capital values of property can be realized, but they are not necessary. Whether or not they actually are is another matter for investigation. So that's all very interesting. And it comes out very clearly in these studies that Matthias has done. But doesn't to me call for this concept of rent gap. The second reason why I think I'm a bad person to invite this evening is that I've never been much of a user of the word gentrification. I may be the only person in the room who was actually taught by Ruth Glass. Mike Harlow is here. He may have had the same experience.
I had a close encounters with her, Mike.
Close encounters. Well, I mean, she wasn't terribly interested in gentrification, I know. She was interested in class. Powerfully interested in class. And gentrification was something she was studying as an exemplification of how class relations were changing in parts of Islington. But she spent the whole of her life in London trying to influence class relations and so on. I don't think she was trying to market this notion of gentrification particularly, and it's never seemed to me to be that fundamental a concept. Though I've been involved in it, doing the carpentry and occupying derelict buildings and turning them into lovely buildings, so I'm a culprit. And I've been a beneficiary of it because I've lived in gentrified neighborhoods and buildings with great pleasure in London. And I've been involved in defending people against gentrification in huge struggles at King's Cross and elsewhere. So I had a lot to do with it, but I don't find it conceptually very, very useful. It's a helpful idea in campaigning and in writing for newspapers and being on television and all that kind of thing. And it's rather worrying at the moment in London because there are people in the London Assembly who are wondering whether we could get gentrification made into a formal concept in the British planning system, you know, grounds on which you could refuse a development permission that it would produce gentrification. And to me, this is a horror story in the making, but trying to turn this perhaps useful but very loose concept into something in law. It's just a recipe for legal fees and endless unproductive battles. So let's not codify it into law or policy. Let's have more research like this, more case studies of more countries and different production regimes. Please will somebody do this for Greece and Turkey? Very interesting cases where processes a bit like what you call gentrification takes place and have enormous influence on class structures and so on historically. And will somebody please do some work on this crazy English phenomenon called leasehold tenure, which is currently falling to bits and is so alarming for economists, both Marxist and neoclassical economists, because we all assume that whatever you think about the role of the state, one of its roles is to make markets work and define conditions for market exchange, forms of tenure and stuff, and have courts that enforce them so that markets can operate. And in England, this whole medieval tenure form of leasehold is kind of collapsing, falling to bits. Government doesn't want to get involved. Complete nightmare. It would be very good to study that using the kind of analytical frameworks that you've got in this book. So that's my comment, and I'm sorry if it was too long.
Yeah, that's very wonderful. So thank you so much. And we move straight to Loretta, who is joining us from Boston. Loretta, over to you.
Hello, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, well, hello. For my new life, kind of traversing Boston and London. Very good to see faces I know in London. Hi, Michael. Hi, Matthias. Hi, Hun, and other people. So I'm going to just offer a couple of kind of points that I guess are not provocative, but they're really kind of to get people thinking. But I want to begin by saying how much I enjoyed reading this book. Incredibly well written, 3 really detailed, dense comparative case studies. It really got me thinking, which is good at my age. And of course, Barnsbury in particular. I've still got a home in Islington. I've done a lot of work on Barnsbury, both in my PhD. It featured in the 2008 book Gentrification. And then I did some further work on super gentrification with Tim Butler and some other people. But I just want to start by saying that I think perhaps the 2 camps that Matthias are talking about are perhaps a little bit exaggerated. And it reminds me a bit of when I started my PhD with the Neil Smith versus David Ley camps, and how exaggerated they were, and how there was almost kind of, you can kind of had to be in one camp or the other. The middle ground was missing. And how actually over a period of time, there was recognition that those camps were not as diverse or opposed as people thought they were at the time. So that's just one thing to put on the table. The other thing I want to say is that I think anti-gentrification activists don't necessarily need to look to case studies like this. I think possibly it's the resistance to gentrification literature and gentrification studies that anti-gentrification activists might get more out of, even if they do need some understanding of processes of what causes gentrification. And I think they're 2 different literatures. So I see this book very much as a more, I guess, detailed explication of the planetary gentrification thesis that myself and Hun and Ernesto Lopez Morales worked on. But in a way, I think Matthias can't quite bring himself to identify it as such, but I think he kind of does around the edges. And of course, there's 3 detailed case studies here, but they're not in the global south, they're not in the global east. So that means the kind of post-colonial theory that we drew on in planetary gentrification has a different take if you're looking at these particular cities and these particular takes. And what might that be? Can we still draw on some of this kind of post-colonial theory and new ideas in urban studies when talking about 3, you know, at the end of the day, even Russia, European case studies? I think that our planetary gentrification thesis says very much like Matthias does, that gentrification reflects the conditions of capitalism. It reflects the conditions of capitalist land and housing at particular points in time, and that gentrification is made possible through specific institutional constellations. And it's that coming together, I think, in kind of moments of opportunity for gentrification over time of different things that really trigger this process forward and actually trigger new types of gentrification and new forms of gentrification. Now, of course, a bit like Matthias, we didn't set out in our planetary gentrification work looking for gentrification around the world. That wasn't the plan at all. We didn't set out to verify gentrification in different places. What we did is look empirically at what were the kind of necessary, but also the contingent relationships that need to be in place to create a process of gentrification or produce one. And of course, like Matthias, we also argued that the state was central that the state had been under-theorized in gentrification studies to date. The state floats around a lot in early gentrification studies. Some stuff's more detailed than others, but for the most part, there wasn't systematic kind of honing in on the role of the state. But if you look back at early forms of gentrification, so I was thinking back to my own work on London and New York City, which definitely, in the mid-90s into the early 2000s, looked at the state, the role of the state, looked at particular institutions. So the role of the state in enacting conservation or preservation policies, the role of institutions like the work I did in Park Slope in Brooklyn and New York City, Brooklyn Union Gas, gentrified buildings to act as a kind of precursor to trigger further gentrification so that people would start buying more gas and their profits would go up. Con Ed, the electricity company, did the same. They had projects called the Cinderella projects. And of course, in the planetary gentrification work we've done, we talked about state-owned land, about how state-owned land had actually been handed over to, kind of producers of gentrification. So that's just a commentary on that. And then on the rent gap, I totally agree with Matthias. I think Neil Smith's rent gap, wonderful as it is oversimplified. I think it's under-empiricized, and I think even Neil would have agreed it was under-empiricized, partly because it's very difficult to empiricize it. And it doesn't engage enough with the impact of the state. It doesn't engage enough with the impact of other institutions, non-state institutions, in disinvestment and reinvestment processes. And I think the political floats around in the background, the political preconditions. But I do think that in the New Urban Frontier, Neil did go and try to talk through some of those political preconditions when he talked about the gentrification of prime time, zero tolerance policy being enacted on the streets of New York, all that kind of stuff. But then it made me thinking about the rent gap, the work that I did on super gentrification in Brooklyn Heights, which was an interesting example. Where did the rent gap fit with that? Here was a ready gentrified, maturely gentrified neighborhood that re-gentrified. So there wasn't disinvestment in the sense of a rent gap form of disinvestment. So what we ended up with was new forms of higher reinvestment by a set of very well-heeled kind of financial workers in the city, lots of international money, etc. What does that mean? How does that fit with the rent gap? And again, the rent gap thinks itself as something that has before gentrification and then it's triggered and gentrification's happened. But it doesn't think beyond that as to what might the future of that particular gentrification be. It doesn't just become static in time. We could then get degentrification, we could get regentrification. There are different ways of looking at it. So I think we need more focus on some of those complexities. And there is work coming out. So, for example, Blacksmith's work on Airbnbification in New York, it talks about the fact there wasn't disinvestment there, but Airbnb exploited some form of rent gap. But again, we need kind of more critical analysis of what that might be. Thirdly, comparative urbanism. Of course, comparative urbanism is something that I've been excited about for a while. It's something that's become quite dominant now in urban studies, but particularly in urban geography in the UK, perhaps less so outside the UK, interestingly. But I still think we need much more, despite Jenny Robinson's new book, much more on methodology, on methods, on the doing of comparative urbanism. And I think Matthias has some really good examples in there thinking this through. But, it got me thinking then, in Berlin, what does that mean in terms of gentrification enabling and also being restricted by the state? How does comparative urbanism feed into that? It got me thinking about Matthias's positionality as a German academic and, in Germany being very embedded in the state and state-driven and all that kind of stuff. Did that cloud your judgment, Matthias? Just a question. And, now we think about the Ukraine war, the impact of Brexit, the impact of the fuel and energy crisis on all three of these cities. What is that going to mean now for gentrification going forward in these three particular places? What does your book do for looking at the future of gentrification here, Matthias? And last, just quickly, time. So I spent yesterday proofreading a new planetary gentrification reader that's coming out. And one of the sections we have there is on time. And I think time is something that's been missed out a lot. So temporality, the timing of gentrification. How far back do we go? Can we look at Berlin in the 1800s? Can we look at St. Petersburg in the 1700s? Are there earlier examples of gentrification? We're not just looking forward, but actually also looking back. Is post-war the tipping point for this transition into gentrification or not? Most of the literature tends to use that kind of post-war breaking point. But as we've already seen, there are examples of earlier gentrifications before that. So how can we talk about those two? So that's me. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you very much. So maybe you can kind of give the mic back to Matthias for briefly responding to these comments, and then we'll collect some questions from the audience here and also from the Zoom. So if you are joining us from Zoom, please use the chat box to post your questions, and we'll try to pick some of them in Q&As. Matthias, the question about rent gap.
Lots of questions. Well, I mean, first, thanks, Loretta and Michael, both for the compliments, but also for the critiques. And I can't respond to all of them now, both because I have to think about them first, and of course, because we don't have enough time. So I thought maybe I say a few words on 2 points. If you insist on other points, just let me know. Okay. The first is a bit to Michael. I mean, you raised the question why one should actually use the term gentrification when it's so blurry. And you talked a lot about it, that gentrification hardly made much sense for you in the first place and so on. Well, my answer would be, quite frankly, it's because the concept and the discussion is there. And let me, I mean, just give two very vivid examples for that. I think throughout the last 2 decades, I've hardly ever been to an international urban studies conference where there was not a session on gentrification. You have now meters and meters of literature on gentrification, and gentrification has rightfully become a battlefield of different approaches. So dealing with gentrification, studying gentrification enables one to actually apply different perspectives and tackle with different strategies in urban research. So, I mean, just for that very reason, it makes sense, to still hold on with the field, engage with it. And the second story I want to share here is actually something that happened to me yesterday. Yesterday, I took the bus from Peckham to Aldgate. And when we passed by Elephant and Castle, well, actually next to me in the bus was a working class family with their teenage daughter. And when we were passing by that big hole, the construction site at Elephant and Castle, the woman said, "Oh my God, what happened here? Why did they knock down that shopping center?" And then the daughter said, "Well, I guess they want to make it more shiny and expensive." And then the woman said, gentrification. And the man said, gentrification, and that was all there was to tell, right? And I can't think of any other academic concept which would enable, that kind of conversation between a few very specialized experts, some of whom sitting in the room here or are online, and, people you meet at the bus. So, I mean, for this very reason, I would keep with the term gentrification despite its critiques, despite all the critiques. So that's the one point I wanted to reflect upon this. The other was about when my positionality in the position of this study in the context of global debates about comparative urbanism. I mean, there have been different reasons why I took exactly these cities. I think conceptually they are variegated enough to allow for dissimilar cases. And sorry, Loretta, but I disagree. Geographically, you are right. All the 3 cities are located in Europe, but I mean, even Berlin or London are very, very different when it comes to what social housing actually means, what a private rental means, what the role of the state is, what the city can or cannot do. And it's even more different in Russia. So I would say, even with the method I use and even with the cases I use, you can talk about a lot of difference. If I would have been able to include more cases, I would have ended up with even more in other rent gaps. And even if I would have studied different neighborhoods in, say, London or Berlin, I would have ended up with other commodification gaps. I'm pretty sure about that. But the practical reason why I chose these 3 cases is actually that Russian, German, and English are the only languages I speak to a degree which allows actual research in these cities. I wouldn't have been able to do a research on Kolkata or Buenos Aires just because I don't speak the languages. And then I think that, well, I strongly believe, in in-depth research. I find research strategies where, you travel somewhere with a translator for 2 weeks and then, have people to tell their stories, and then you produce some simplified version of it, which is enough to get something published in Urban Studies. I find that highly problematic, both for ethical reasons, but also for the outcomes it produces. So I think the simple answer is I did what I could, in getting as diverse cases as I could study. And that also reflects on my positionality. I mean, of course, I am a German, so it's no wonder that I'm even a Prussian. I grew up in Berlin, in Prussia, under state socialism. So it's not very surprising that, the state sort of comes to my attention when seeing other cases. But I mean, nobody can escape his or her positionality, right? So that is the specific positionality I can bring into comparative discussions. Others have other positionalities. So maybe I'll stop it here and we open the room for discussions. I mean, just let me know if there's something that I should have answered and should have responded to and didn't. Just remind me.
Okay, maybe I have time for some questions from the audience. And I'm keeping my eyes on the chat box for those who are joining us via Zoom. So, here's your moment. Do you ask any questions related to what you're hearing, or also something that you are already acquainted with and you want some views of the speaker or the discussant? We have a good mix of students and experts in gentrification studies as well as other urban studies.
I'm not an expert, but the rent gap theory.
So can I just ask you
that was a void. I'm Robin Brown. I'm a member of a community network called Just Space, and we try to influence the mayor's strategic London plan from a grassroots level. But so far, I thought there was a void there, voiding.
Yeah, not necessarily a question. But
no, but
comment and suggestion.
It's a rather impolite observation, I think.
Let's get a few more and maybe start with Ian and Paul in that order.
Ian Gordon, I'm a bit more like an urban economist, I guess, in this context. It strikes me that this is things that are missing from the background to the story. This is a special case. These are special cases of invasion. So if we think back to Chicago, this is about invasion and succession of a particular kind. And one of the things going through my head is, well, it doesn't always have to occur, it hasn't historically always occurred in the direction you're talking about. So sites can be captured by poorer people, not necessarily by richer people. Either they've been captured in quite peaceful ways because they have demands to live at high densities, and others or can be done like Brackman in Notting Hill. And I think Brackman in Notting Hill in the 1950s is a nice example of commodification. Nice, it's a very nasty example of the commodification of space for more intensive use by poorer people, immigrant communities coming in, but it has most of the downsides that you associate with gentrification. So the thing about gentrification you have somehow to bring in why it is the gentry, in particular instances, who are the invaders in this. What's that conditioned by? And I think somehow all that disappears into the background of the story.
Let's get one more and then let Matthias respond.
Yeah, It's actually a question for Michael, if that's all right. Obviously, Michael, you're terribly familiar with what gentrification is, and I'm just curious could you say a bit more about why it is that you think that gentrification is not that helpful analytically, but politically? I'd be really interested to hear what your take on that is.
Well, quickly, I mean, I like the elephant and castle story very much. And I agree with you. If a word becomes sufficiently common use and understood in population at large, then we all have to use it. And it may be useful to use it to help mobilize, persuade people and so on. I think the point I was trying to make was I don't find it analytically a very helpful idea, but it is an incredibly useful word in the general vocabulary. We use lots of words in argument and discussion, which are pretty tricky if you really try and pin them down and turn them into law or definitions. And the other one that bothers me all the time is community. You know, I use it a lot. I say, well, what does the community think? Well, I know perfectly well there are hundreds of communities. They all think different things. You can read Peter Marcuse about the different meanings of the word, but all the same, there are contexts where it's useful to talk in those terms. So
that's true for many academic terms as well. I mean, think of the state, think of power, think of society, capital.
Yes, but there are some concept we use where we do have precise definitions. We know what we mean when we talk about capital, I would say. We probably know what we mean when we talk about power, and if pressed, we could define it. But there are also words which we never could really define very precisely, but are still useful to use in argument.
Could you just clarify though, what analytically, what is the main problems with it that you see? I'm really interested to know.
Good question. Did you get it?
Yeah, I got. Well, the really powerful concepts in there to me are what sort of capital accumulation is going on? Who's being exploited by whom in these relationships? And it may involve the replacement of a lower social class segment with a higher social class segment through displacement or price changes or all the other mechanisms you talked about. But as Ian Gordon said, it can be the reverse. And we've got these really interesting processes going on now in outer London in areas which historically we think of as rather posh, rather respectable, mostly white, aspirational residential boroughs in the periphery of London, which are in a patchy way being bought up by people to use as private rentals. So we've got small or large buyers, I don't know who they are, buying these houses and filling them with tenants, often at very high densities, and often building sheds in the garden and filling those with tenants. And probably some of the students here are living in those conditions. That's a kind of reverse gentrification, but it's still a very powerful bit of capital accumulation going on the part of whoever's doing it.
But can I just say, presumably a century ago, the same thing happened in Barnsley. Similar thing happened in Barnsley. So Barnsley became working class.
Can I get one or two more comments from the audience and let Matthias, in this case, respond to that, and Michael and Oliver? Can you just introduce who you are for the rest of the people?
Michael Harlow. I do think that Ruth Glass did use gentrification in a very limited way to describe movement into areas such as Islington and Notting Hill in the late 50s and early 60s of the professional middle class, but not actually the very wealthy professional class. She talked about people like teachers and social workers and other professionals who had to work in London, who can no longer afford London housing. But I wanted to make a different point, really, which is what we're talking about here. I'm not sure I like the term commodification gap. What we're talking about is how the value of housing gets changed by market factors and also by political factors, by the state. For example, in America, in the 60s and 70s, large amounts of housing, particularly in inner cities, were reduced in value by mortgage redlining. So that there are processes working in both directions. I haven't really studied Outer London, but I know there are parts of Outer London when I was a child and lived there where the values were quite high, and you can see now areas of deteriorated housing in Outer London. But I think, relatively speaking, the values have fallen because different processes have created that relative decommodification of housing. So I think Matthias is onto something very important in terms of trying to describe the specific conditions in lives because of decommodification of housing. I'm not sure I like the terminology of gap, actually. I would just talk about those processes more generally across the city.
Let's get one more from there.
Thanks for your talk this evening. I'm Oliver Norman, London Borough of Forest. And so I'm one of the kind of practitioners, planning professionals who is in some way a part of this kind of institutionalization, if we could call it that, of gentrification, how it touches down in outer London. And I was interested to hear Loretta say actually that, you know, activists should look to the anti-gentrification literature for the inspiration of how to combat gentrification. But I think hopefully what this book does is give some tools to the policy professionals and people who are maybe trying to understand the phenomena in terms of how, you know, what those enabling and disabling conditions are in the abstract, diagnosing those before we see the gentrification actually enacted, because I think there's a kind of a will politically to do that sort of piece of work to understand what those preconditions are so that you can kind of cut it off at the source. So I'm fascinated to hear more about the kind of those enabling and disabling conditions, which might be some conclusions of the book I sense. But thanks for your talk.
Do you like to? I try to. I hope it doesn't take too long. Let me say a few words again, you know, on the definition of gentrification and, you know, where it should be applied and where not, you know, and how different ideas about what gentrification makes up, how they play into. So for me, the two most important points about defining gentrification, I follow Eric Clark's definition here for the gentrification buffs in the audience. So the two most important things are an investment into the built environment. And this investment is connected to a displacement of people of a lower social strata by higher social strata. So these two moments have to come together to call something gentrification for me. If displacement happens and it doesn't have to do anything with investment and profit, like in the case of, say, ethnic cleansing, I wouldn't call it gentrification. If there is investment without social change, like in the case of incumbent upgrading, I wouldn't call it gentrification. And then there is, of course, a lot of other things happening in our cities, which are just not gentrification, right? I mean, of course, there are neighborhoods which used to be middle class and are downgraded now because developers found other business models, right? And so on and so forth. So there are a massive amount of other things that happen that are not gentrification. And there might be even more important processes in cities that I don't know so well, which are not gentrification. So I'm talking about some very specific things. And for me, really, the core of gentrification is the combination of investment, which means putting capital into land for the sake of profit, with the displacement of a lower social strata by a higher social strata. And I do think if you put that into the core, then calling something gentrification instead of, say, regeneration, revitalization, change of atmosphere has some benefits. Okay? It has to be said, and then I think the people in the room who are even older than me, I think, emphasized it, because I think that's partly the story you went through in London in the 1960s and 70s. I was born in 1970 on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And I mean, what I can see from reading your pieces is that the way that gentrification was conceptualized and used changed tremendously in the last decades. So when gentrification first came up, and when the term was invented by Ruth Glass, it was a deeply ironic way to describe some changes that were visible in inner London at that moment in time. Then the term sort of traveled, you know, to the US, where it was used in a background that was already very different from London in the 60s. Traveled back to Europe, Western Europe first, and then, you know, it spread across the world. And then I think in this process, the association with young, middle-class, professional, partly intellectual, partly cultural home buyers that was so deeply embedded into the early notion of gentrification in England in the 1960s and 70s sort of got lost and lost its relevance. So, and that is, you know, why I also don't use these Chicago school influenced models of gentrification being identified with an invasion of middle class into other areas, into low class areas anymore. Because I do think that class structures, lifestyles, property markets work so immensely different in different countries that I wouldn't see how much this makes sense. So if I would identify gentrification with young middle-class home buyers who drink latte macchiato and would try and take that elsewhere, I mean, I would be sure that I can't find gentrification. It only leads, I think, Loretta, and you have this term, it leads to a fossilization of this term. Is that the right word? Fossilization was the fossilization of this term, but it's not of use anymore. And that is, you know, why I totally refrained from even using what was back in the 1980s and 90s called demand-side theories of gentrification. I only focused upon supply-side theories and upon the connection between investment and displacement. So my commodification gap really speaks to this part of the debate. Then the second thing on activism.
Can I actually stop you there very briefly? And I have one question that lingers on my mind, and I hope I'm mindful of the time remaining. And I want to use this remaining time to ask one question, which I think is related to activism, by the way. Yeah. So maybe it's a nice way of wrapping up. When you look at the urban studies literature on Global South, and we don't really come across that much in it. I'm here, I speak as a person who has been working with Loretta, and also having my own share of contribution to the literature on gentrification in the Global South, including Asia in particular. But you come across with more stories and case studies of how poor people and so on are kind of making actions, like in the Benjamin Solomon's occupancy urbanism, for example, or James Holston in Latin American context of insurgent citizenship. These are the kind of concepts that are being discussed to emphasize how people who are marginalized or who are poor are making actions to claim their territories and their presence. Whereas when you look at the gentrification literature in the Western context, I wonder whether, and here's a question to Pastor Loretta as well as Matthias, in your view, what will be the kind of equivalent terms in the Western context of Europe in particular and the US that can be comparable to occupancy, urbanism, or insurgent citizenship kind of things, without referring to gentrification, which often describes or depicts the poor people as victims of the process, and rather than having agency. So that's probably linking to activism question, I guess, here as a way of wrapping up. So Loretta, I guess we'll give you a chance to respond to that as well.
Yeah, just say I'm really pleased there are practitioners in the audience, and I think that it's very important for practitioners to have a look at the various anti-gentrification toolkits that are now available, not just for London, but actually also for Western Europe, for Southern Europe, the US, etc. But to get back to Fun's question, I think that This stuff is growing, and I think in the US in particular now, you know, we're kind of awaiting a massive wave of evictions due to mortgage default, due to the rise in the cost of living and other stuff, partly due to the energy crisis, but partly due to a load of inflationary pressures that are separate from that. And I think that that kind of kickback from local groups and local organisations is on the rise. And I know certainly in Boston and in New York, and in other parts of New England more broadly, the community land trust movement is definitely on the rise, and groups of people are banding together to buy up pockets of land and pockets of property to be able to control their property's future outside of the kind of structures of global capitalism. And in my mind, that's one of many.
Okay, so maybe we hand over back to Matthias for final wrapping up response and comments.
But it's hard to wrap up this debate, and I wish we had more time, and also we could continue this debate over a glass of beer. So if anybody wants to join me, please feel highly welcome. And Loretta, I know you can't join, but it would be a great pleasure to have that opportunity.
There's a pub right behind this building, by the way, so that's where we are going to read the speakers. So please feel free to join us.
But a few last words. I think the bottom line of my book is that gentrification is highly a political thing. It's made possible by state actions, and it's also made impossible by state actions. The state as such is not a monolith, but it's, as Poulantzas would say, a crystallization of a balance of forces in political struggles, right? So social movements can impact on what the state does not, and how this impacts on gentrification. And that is why I think this commodification gap can be of use in enforcing researchers to do exactly this analysis. And again, I mean, and of course, I mean, there's a lot of more things that social movements need. And then partly this is dealt with in urban social movements literature, partly in the concepts that Yun just mentioned. So it's not like gentrification literature, gentrification theory can answer all questions for social movements. Sometimes you just have to look at other strands of literature. But again, I mean, just from my personal experience, for the last 8 or 9 years, I worked pretty well together with a group of social housing tenants in Berlin, who became very popular and very well known in the media because they were very successful in launching protests. And once they became well known, Coty and Co for those people who know the Berlin scene a bit. And what they told me is once they became popular and well known, they were run over by PhD students and postdocs who wanted to write their thesis on them. And they said the only thing that these PhD students wanted to know were either insurgent identities, post-autonomous ways of seeing things, or they were interested in telling them that gentrification has to do something with global capitalism. And I mean, those things were absolutely not of use to them. So what they said, what we actually would need is somebody who understands actual housing policies, who understands the debates, who understands the legal instruments that are there. And that is not what you learn even as a critical geographer at universities. So they were actually pretty frustrated. And at a point, the group decided not to engage with any academics anymore until they are willing to clean up the room and do 3 night shifts. So I don't think that academics can provide all sorts of answers for social movements, and also the form of knowledge production that we have in the academy is different from the actual practical needs of social movements. But what I do think is that we can try to be better, to achieve more, and to bring our analysis closer to the actual political issues around gentrification. And then I hope that my book was not actually something like a guidebook for activists, was meant as an intervention into a theory debate in urban studies. It was meant to push our disciplines more into a direction where they can answer questions in a way that is useful for activists and policymakers.
Right. So I guess let me just say a couple more, make a couple of announcements. here's the leaflet. There's a few copies lying around. So if you are interested in obtaining this copy, the Commodification Gap, please feel free to take a copy of this leaflet. Probably the most important keyword to take away here is SSHJB, which is a 20% discount code for you to purchase the book. So that's the important code for you to take away. There's another event Southeast Asia Center is happy to host again this week on Thursday, which is Decentering Critical Urban Scholarship, which is involving conversations with the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research members of editorial board, as well as some editors. And as one of the editors of the journal, I'll be really looking forward to welcoming many of you back to those meetings, the event on Thursday. So please go to the Southeast Asia Center website or the IJURR website for more details about registration and the venue details. And also please visit the center and also the Urban Salon website for more future events, and you can subscribe to the mailing list as well to stay in touch with us. Well, let me thank Loretta for joining us all the way from Boston. It's really wonderful to have you back in this London event, and Michael Edwards for joining us with your wonderful view. And your skepticism is precisely why we are inviting you to this event to make this discussion a lot more interesting. And last but not least, Matthias, for this wonderful book and for joining us all the way from Berlin. And thanks so much and congratulations on this book again. And many thanks to the audience on Zoom and in the room for joining us. And as Matthias says, we'll be moving to the park right behind this building, White Horse. And if you are here to have more conversation with Matthias, feel free to join us. Thanks.
Can I just say one thing? That although the book may not have been written for activists or indeed for professionals and policy people, it will be very useful to both groups. So you need to find a way to get it out there, I would say, to Waltham Forest and everywhere else, where there are readers who would really get a lot out of it.
Great, thank you so much.